Hello everyone, this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 12th episode of Microsoft RF Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft RF Code. Microsoft RF Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning HTML5 application development. And this is the fourth and the last episode of this series. I hope that you have watched all the episodes of this course. If you have missed any of our courses and want to rewatch it, just visit our website www.millionlights.org and get all the courses from there. Now, let's move towards the course. This course is divided into 10 modules. Each module introduces a new concept and reinforces the earlier topics. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Cullen, supervisor of IT Academy programs from Microsoft with us. He is going to talk about how to create an application with HTML5. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor or a 32-bit processor. Other required tools are a Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's have a look at the topics we have covered so far and what are the new topics we are going to learn. In the previous episodes, we covered the application lifecycle, building the user interface part 1, building the user interface part 2, CSS Essentials part 1, CSS Essentials part 2, managing text flow by using CSS, managing the graphical interface by using CSS. In this episode, we will cover Module 8, Understanding JavaScript and Coding Essentials, manage and maintain JavaScript, and update the UI by using JavaScript from the HTML5 App Development Fundamentals exam. Module 9, Creating Animations, working with graphics, and accessing data code animations by using JavaScript. And Module 10, JavaScript coding for the touch interface response to the touch interface. So let's get started.
All right, welcome back to Module 9. Sorry, recover. All right, welcome back to Module 8. We're going to start talking about JavaScript today. I'm Cullen once again. Right now, let's go ahead and get started with understanding JavaScript and coding essentials. This is really fun for me. This is some of my favorite stuff to talk about. We're going to hit up objectives 4.1, manage and maintain JavaScript. More specifically, talk about what JavaScript is. Talk about functions and variables in JavaScript, and then just really quickly touch on jQuery and some other third-party libraries. We're going to talk about how to update the user interface with using JavaScript as well with Objective 4.2. More specifically, locating and accessing elements, listening and responding to events, and then also updating the content of elements. Some of the really cool things that you can do with JavaScript and HTML. All right, so we use JavaScript to build interactive applications. Speaking of Java and JavaScript are definitely not the same thing. Do not confuse those two things. So anyway, HTML5 and CSS3 are awesome for creating engaging, like beautiful websites, but they're not interactive without JavaScript. Right? We need that programming language and that programming power of JavaScript in order to make the wonderfully interactive and engaging websites that we view on a regular basis. JavaScript is a loosely typed scripting language that's interpreted by a browser. And loosely typed means it's not super rigid. You don't have to declare a bunch of file types and other things along those lines. I won't get too far into that programming jargon because it can definitely bog down all the wonderful things that we're doing here today. It's an entirely different course, in fact. But it changes how elements in an HTML document act and respond to user input. And so we use JavaScript to create scripts, these files that are essentially step-by-step instructions that tell a browser how to respond to events, like a user clicking a button. The file extension, by the way, for JavaScript files is JS, just in case you missed it. We can connect our JavaScript to an HTML document in ways that are very similar to what we do with CSS. We can either embed the JavaScript into an HTML document with a script tag, and that actually can be placed inside of the head tags, or it can be placed inside of the body with your code. And then two, you can link a separate JavaScript file to the HTML document the same way that you do with CSS. The difference is that our type is different, right? We have text/JavaScript, and then our source here is also going to point to a .js file. Okay, keep those things in mind. All right, so let's take a quick look at JavaScript in action, just a really basic example. And note right here, I embedded the text using script tags, okay? So we'll open this up, and what's going to happen is I've got H1 elements, I've got script here, and what's going to happen is it's going to access the document object, and on that document it's going to write hello world. So let's see if hello world shows up. See, it was a boring website. It's not anymore because it says hello world, right? I don't know. I think that's fun. Not really. I'm just joking you. I have a dry sense of humor. All right. Let's go ahead and get back to our presentation. Right? So that's just a basic example of what JavaScript can do. Let's talk a little bit more about JavaScript, because you see this script on the screen, you see all this dot notation occurring, all these other things that are really unfamiliar to us coming from HTML and CSS. JavaScript relies on functions to perform a lot or rather to provide a lot of the functionality that we get out of it. A function is a group of statements that are simply combined to perform a specific task. And so this right here, this whole thing is a function. And a statement is just simply a line of code that performs an action. So this line of code down there at the bottom creates an alert box that'll pop up that says, you just did something awesome. And it'll actually take your name too. If different parts of a script repeat the same task, then it's probably a pretty good idea for you to go ahead and take those different parts, create a function, and then do something called calling the function later in your script. Okay? And we'll actually show you how to do that here in just a moment. First things first, though, let's talk about how to define one of these functions. You've got a couple of different parts. You've got your function keyword, right? Every function starts off with function. You've got your function name. In this case, we have hello world. And then we have a statement, right? Alert happens to be a method, right? And then we have what alert is going to present to us. So it's going to create an alert box that says hello world. Everything between the curly braces is often referred to as a code block. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Whether like what you refer to a JavaScript function as, whether it's a code block or whatever it happens to be, whether you're calling it a function, that stuff isn't necessarily going to be tested on the exam, but you should definitely be aware of the vocabulary that's used on a regular basis. I'm self-taught, and so I still make a couple of mistakes every now and then because I didn't have like a really awesome teacher who told me how to pronounce everything properly. So a lot of it is me trying to just sort of figure things out online, and so definitely don't worry if you're messing things up or if you feel like you're not doing things right. Like I said, the best way to learn this is by experimentation, and then try to link up with some really, really smart, great, skilled people later. They'll definitely help you out quite a bit too. Okay? So let's talk about naming functions. A function can have any name. Our last one was hello world, but there are a couple of guidelines that you have to consider, right? We don't want to use any of the reserved words that are defined by JavaScript standards. And these are words that, that may be used in the future. Also, we don't want to use keywords that are used with HTML, CSS, anything of that nature. Try to name the function specifically after the action that it's performing. Right. I've got a quick link there that you can take a look when you download the presentation to notice all the different reserved words in JavaScript. The name also has to be made of letters, digits, underscores, or dollar signs. It cannot, absolutely cannot start with a number. Cannot. That's tested. I remember that being on my exam, actually, not too long ago. So another important thing to point out is that there's a difference between how you define a function and then how you execute it. The way that a function is defined is different from how it's executed by a browser. The definition clearly outlines names, its parameters that it may take, like a value such as somebody's name, and then also its statements. When a function's called, however, the browser actually executes all the statements within the function. Very different from just defining it, whereas those statements aren't ran by the browser. They aren't executed. They just sit there until they're called upon. So here's an example at the bottom of the screen of defining a function, right? We're going to do something awesome. That's the name of our function. And then we call the function, so when we click a button that says click me, we're actually going to do something awesome. All right. Another thing that's really important with JavaScript is understanding variables. Scripts have to temporarily store pieces of information like your first name, your last name, your date of birth, anything else that you might use when you're playing a video game or doing something like that. These bits of data, they're stored as variables. They're called variables because those values can vary based on whoever happens to be using an application or a website, and you might even change those variables each time that you use it, or use a website or use an app. Variables are simply defined with the var syntax with a unique keyword such as height or width, right? And so here, I've got an example. You've got your variable keyword. Then you have a name, height. We might want to change it to like building height or ceiling height or something along those lines in order to specify what it happens to be the height of. We have an assignment operator. Here it's the equal sign. And so what happens is we're taking the value 6 and we're saying, hey, 6 is going to be temporarily stored in the variable height. And 6, of course, happens to be our variable value here. Okay, just some fun stuff to learn. There are some rules for naming variables. Take a look at these. These are super important. It'll help you pick and select really great names for your variables, and it'll make sure that you don't present yourself with any problems when you're developing for the web. Okay. Lastly, I want to talk about a couple of different data types or types of data, right? You can store numbers inside of variables, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. You can store strings of characters, like zombies freak me out can be stored in a variable. The one thing with strings is that they have to always be surrounded by quote marks. So if I have var words, and I could say, I like stuff. I really do, so I'm gonna use an exclamation mark. And then I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that I add the ending quote marker on the outside of it. That would go ahead and store this entire sentence, this entire string inside of the variable words. We could also store true and false values, known as booleans, inside of variables as well. So lots of stuff to keep in mind and keep track of, but as you continue to program, you'll know this stuff like the back of your hand. Finally, if you want to want to add comments to your JavaScript code, you can add single line comments with 2 forward slashes. And then just like with CSS, you can add multi-line comments with a forward slash and then a asterisk, right? And you've got to add that pair. And then of course the ending asterisk and forward slash as well, right? So keep those things in mind. All right, real quickly, JavaScript is wonderful, but it can be really challenging to use when you're just getting started. And there are other JavaScript libraries that are available that are entirely comprised of code that other programmers have already developed. And so you've got pre-written functions and statements that you can use in order to create your programs, and it can save you a lot of time and effort. You can use these libraries by linking their files to your web page just like you do with your own JavaScript files. One of the most important ones is jQuery, right? Or rather, not necessarily important. It's not necessarily more important than any of the others, but it's definitely really, really popular. And it allows you to use CSS-like selectors and its methods to perform functions with minimal code. Do yourself a favor and do a quick Bing search for jQuery. You'll come up with so much information, and there are a lot of online tutorials available for you, and I strongly recommend that you take a look at them. It's definitely worth your time. You'll be able to do a lot of really cool things in learning about jQuery. Okay. All right, next, let's talk about locating and accessing elements. JavaScript relies entirely on objects, okay? And HTML object or HTML elements are objects, right? Just like houses and cars in real life. Kind of crazy to think about that. Every time I say it out loud, it just sort of throws me off a little bit. But just as with real life objects, we can modify HTML objects and the way that they appear on the screen or the way that they act and function. These objects that appear on our screen are typically grouped into things called object models, which are used to represent browsers and web pages. And so this whole thing right here is a window object, and everything on the inside of it, right, is part of the document object. And so you'll see that we'll say document.write. We used that in an earlier example. That's what we're referring to when we say document, okay? The document object model creates a model of a web page. And so, as I just mentioned, talking about the document object, that's what the document object model refers to. All right, we use it to update content, structure, and styles on the fly. And this guy right here is super important for us. We're going to reference that a lot, especially in these next couple of examples. Another important aspect of this is to think about the fact that this document object is actually made up of a bunch of other objects as well. And so it has child objects that represent each of the individual elements on a page. And so you see a lot of them like title and head, and then we have body and div, and then of course our paragraphs, and then our text. This guy should not be there. Not supposed to have an end bracket, but text is definitely a child object. So, all right, so we can locate and access these elements by using the getElementById method. And this is something that's definitely going to be tested on the exam. We access the document object. We make reference to it, right? We use the getElementById method for the document object. And then we add in the parameter here of demo. And demo is actually going to be a specific element's ID. And this means, of course, that the element must have an ID, or else this won't work and we can't access it. We use this method to go ahead and manipulate the contents of it. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that in action, all right? All right, so I'm opening up my getElement demo. What we want to do right here is we're going to go ahead and get today's date and add it to an element on the page. So I'm actually going to use another element that we're going to talk about in just a moment called .innerHTML. It's another method, right? We're going to access this paragraph element by its ID, and then we're going to set its innerHTML, everything that happens to be in between these two tags, to today's date. Let's see how this works. Boom, there it is. Pacific Daylight Time 2. It even gives you the time zone. That is exciting. And every time you refresh, notice how it updates the time. Pretty cool stuff. All right. So now back to the presentation, and we'll actually be using the getElementById method just a couple more times. Another thing that you have to be prepared to do when creating really engaging web apps is listen and respond to events. So when we interact with a web page, we're doing a lot of clicking, we might do scrolling, and maybe we're actually touching it on a tablet or on our home PC. And so we've got to be prepared to build a web page that is going to listen for mouse clicks or listen for touches and taps so that it interacts properly with what we intend to do with the web page, right? So that it responds in the proper way. So let's talk about some events in programming. You have form submission, so you press the submit button. You have keystrokes, you type keys. You make a click on a touchpad or a mouse. Maybe the page just loads or unloads, and then you also may select items. Well, there are event handlers like on submit, on key down, on click, on load, and on select that respond to these different events, right? They respond by executing functions. Let's take a look at an event handler in action, okay? Here we have a script with just a basic function, my function. We're using the document, referencing the document object again, and then the getElementById method with demo, right, as the ID. And then we're setting the innerHTML to selecting text is awesome, okay? So we've got an input here. We're going to select some of the text. And let me show you what happens here. We've got our event handler on select. It's set to my function. Notice that, whoops. Notice that the value of on select is set to the name of my function, right? Because that's the method that we want to call. That's the method, or sorry, the function that we want to execute. Just as a quick aside, the words function and method are commonly used interchangeably throughout programming, and so it's really important that you definitely understand that because it can get really confusing really fast, okay? All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this demo now. Good old event handlers. Whoops, it's not there. Let me go back. I'm going to copy my code here. How's this for cheating, guys? I'm okay with it as long as nobody tells on me. All right, so my code's pretty sloppy there, and I can take some time to reformat that, but it's probably a good idea not to because I want to be respectful of your time. So just know that everything that's in the slide is exactly what we're running. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the browser, and let's see what happens here. Whoa! I selected the text, and it was awesome. I loved it. That was great. That's what event handlers can do. They can do a lot, like they can do way more cooler things than that. But definitely keep in mind how powerful they can be. All right, so we're going back to our presentation now, and we'll get started here with updating the content of elements. Right? So you've seen us, add new what seems like new elements to a page. Now we're going to actually go ahead and we're going to change the content of the element, right? So we do this by using the innerHTML property, and that's basically what we've just been doing, right? It can be used on any element. We just go ahead and we set the innerHTML property to a desired string. So it could be whatever we want. We could set it equal to a method that's going to pull data for us as well, like we did previously. We just go ahead and use the equal symbol in order to assign whatever value we want to assign to the innerHTML property. And to remove content, we just set it to an empty string, right? So just a blank string. So let's take a look at our innerHTML demo here. All right. So all that we did here was that we went ahead, we accessed this paragraph by ID. I'm actually going to go ahead and let me do something different here. This is without JavaScript. And then I'm going to just remove this script as a whole. And I'm going to show you what would happen here if we launch the browser. So this is without JavaScript. And if we add that script back in, this getElementById method is going to function, right? We're gonna perform that action. Then we're going to go ahead and set the innerHTML value to using JavaScript is super fun. So if we go back to our browser window and we update it, JavaScript does that without a problem, right? Pretty cool stuff. All right. So now, lastly, let's add new elements to a page. To do that, we use the createElement method. So there's a little bit more heavy coding involved here, but if we want to make elements like images appear on a screen when maybe you click a button, we're going to use the document objects createElement method, and we also have to use, rather, we're going to create the element, then we have to add it to the page using the append child method. So if you take a look at this code over here on the right, like our JavaScript, whoops. Like our JavaScript over here in the top right, we've got a function named showImage. So that function takes a couple parameters. So the source name, the width, the height of the image, and then the alternate text. Okay. The image is document.createElement, right? So we use our createElement method here. We set source equal to image.source. Image.width is set to width, and then, of course, height is set to image.height. And then we assign the value of alt that we pass through as a parameter to image.alt. And so all of these properties of this image object that we just created are going to be stored, and then we add them to the screen using the append child method, right? And so we pass through image as a parameter there. Of course, users don't ever have to see any of that on screen. And in fact, if they just ask to show source, to see the source code for the web page and what I'm going to show you now, all that you see is just, there's a button. When you click it, we're going to call this function, and it's going to display an image, okay? So let's see that in action. Just going to go ahead and launch that in the browser. So now I click display an image, and hey, there's my dog Stella. All right. She's the best dog model ever. She's like $500 an hour in case you guys need any dog photos, just so you know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close out of Internet Explorer, and we're going to keep on trucking with our presentation, okay? All right. And actually, guys, that's it. It's incredible. It's incredible. Makes me want to go back and take a look at my dog again, but I guess I already clicked out of Internet Explorer. Oh well, another time, right? So let's quickly recap everything that we've gone over. 4.1, manage and maintain JavaScript. We talked about what JavaScript is. We talked about its functions and variables, and also some third-party libraries and how they can be used in order to make life a little bit easier for you as a programmer, okay? 4.2, we update the UI by using JavaScript. And that means that we have to locate and access elements. We have to listen and respond to events, and also be able and be ready to update the content of elements. So thanks again for joining me. I'm really enjoying our time together. We're going to go ahead and move on to Module 9, and I'll see you in a little bit, okay? Bye. Welcome back to Module 9. My name's Cullen. We're here continuing our journey through JavaScript on our last leg here before we wrap everything up. Today we're going to talk about how you can use JavaScript to create animations, work with graphics, and also access data, okay? We're not gonna do too many demos. Don't hold it against me. Got a lot of good information for you though, okay? Let's get started. All right, our agenda, we're gonna talk about using JavaScript to create animations, also to manipulate the canvas, how you can do that with JavaScript. We also wanna talk about accessing data, transmitting data, loading and saving files, and also validating form input. We talked about that a little bit earlier, and also touching on cookies again. All right. Animation, of course, is the movement of static images to create the effect of movement, and animation can be used dynamically to move objects in the user interface. We leverage JavaScript to create pretty powerful animations, and like I said, I'm not going to show you a demo, but you do know that we can access individual elements using JavaScript now, and so getting them to perform actions and perform animations should actually be a pretty quick and easy thing. And so some of the stuff that we could talk about is beyond the scope of this course and of the exam, but I strongly encourage you to pursue just more about it, okay? So keep that up and enjoy this animation on screen. It's a crazy star. I didn't do that with JavaScript, just with the magic of PowerPoint, okay? Learn more about creating animations with JavaScript at the Microsoft Developer Network website. You can go ahead and click both of these links. This top one is really great. It's a little bit shorter, and then this second one is really good, but do be aware that it's a little bit longer, okay? Still really good. You should probably read it. All right. Using JavaScript with Canvas. So recall that the canvas element is used to create a container for graphics, right? With JavaScript, you can manipulate that container and draw graphics dynamically. And so we do that with the getElementById method, but we also have to use the canvas.getContext method to create the object itself, right? And so here's an example of how we would do that with Canvas. We'll go to a demo in just a second. Also, there's a cool link to cuttherope.net and a different Microsoft course, and I had to steal it. So I went ahead and added there at the bottom. You can check out that game by clicking that link after you download the PowerPoints. Anyway, here we have Canvas, right? So we've created a canvas element, right? We added in some extra text. Your browser does not support the canvas element if they're using an older browser that doesn't render canvas. Okay, we go ahead, we access the canvas element and store it in a variable in an object C, right? Then we have c.getContext. That's that method that we were talking about earlier, right? The context of it is 2D, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to create the fill style, okay, or rather we're going to set the value of the fill style equal to blue so that we can draw a blue rectangle. It's really important that you use the fill style method before you use the fill rectangle. Think of it like this, right? You couldn't paint a wall unless you went out and you bought paint first, right? You have to have the paint before you can paint a wall, otherwise it's just going to not be painted. Anyway, let's take a look at this example in action, okay? So trust that all of this code is the same stuff that you just saw in the PowerPoint slide deck. We're gonna go ahead and launch the browser, and here, note, I've actually got 2 rectangles. And so it's not. I lied to you guys. I'm so sorry. Sometimes I get so excited that I just want to jump ahead, but what I've done here is we've actually created 2 different canvas objects. So I'm going to go ahead and set the height of one equal to 200, the other a little bit differently. And so now you can see here that we've drawn just one object. You might be like, hey, why on earth do I only see one rectangle on screen? Well, that's because my other canvas object, it's not, sorry, this one is the one I want to show you. Sorry, it's not calling the function. So note here, or rather on load, we're calling F1 which is our function right here. And we access the small rectangle. The ID here for small rectangle is where we're drawing that canvas element. This second one, we're not accessing. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and delete that from my code, and I'll show you here in a second what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, go back, and then refresh this again. There you see just one blue rectangle. So I'm sorry for the confusion on that. If you guys go back and take a look at this demo code, go ahead and copy and paste that into WebMatrix yourself, and you'll get a clean, crisp example that makes a little bit more sense. But just a couple of quick things to point out here. Remember that the ID used in the getElementById method has to be the same as the HTML method that you're referring, or sorry, the HTML element that you're referring to. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about transmitting data. Using a web browser is really interesting, and creating robust interactive applications requires the ability the ability to send and receive data. For this to happen, we have to be able to communicate with servers when we're on our phones and on our PCs and laptops and all those other great devices that we use, right? Note that a user's computer, our computers, are commonly called clients, right? We're able to send data back and forth with servers because of things like JavaScript, right? They make the creation of all of our programs possible and the ability to send and receive data possible, right? So here, you've got a computer sending data to a server, and then, of course, a server sending data back. To further facilitate this, we can use the XMLHttpRequest API. Right? It uses JavaScript to pass data in the form of text strings between a client and a server. And one thing I want to point out now is that HTML is made of text strings, right? All of our tags, all of our keywords, they're all text strings, right? And so the XMLHttpRequest API actually just goes ahead and sends those tags back and forth, right? We've got some basic syntax here for the load function to the right, and I want you guys to note the following here, right? So we go ahead and we create a new XMLHttpRequest object, stored in XHR, right, which is short for XMLHttpRequest. And then the open method here is going to specify the HTTP method for contacting the server, right? So we use get. It's also going to provide the web address as well for that server. Okay? Then when we call the callback function here, we're going to get a response from the server. So we get that response, and then finally, we're going to go ahead and use the send method in order to send data to the server, right? So that's it in action. When we do receive data back from a server, we have to parse which components are going to be used. And so we send all kinds of complex information back and forth. And parsing is the ability to analyze that complex information and break it down into its smaller parts. So with JavaScript, you have a number of options for parsing data so that we can get usernames, access photos associated with those usernames, also get phone numbers, addresses, all that good stuff that we use the web for, right? Get directions, cool stuff like that. With JavaScript, we typically are going to find ourselves using JavaScript object notation to do some of our parsing. And so it's called JSON, right? It's a subset of JavaScript that is used to exchange JavaScript objects with a server. And there are two APIs within JSON, right? You've got the .parse and .stringify APIs. When data is received from a server, the .parse API is used to just go ahead and do the parsing and actually read through the data and break it down into its smaller component parts. And then when the data is sent by a client, the stringify API is used to turn that data into strings so that it can be sent. Next, we'll talk about loading and saving files. So how do we handle data locally, right? JavaScript is wonderful because it actually helps us validate, sorry, let me take a step back. JavaScript allows us to load and save files from our local computer, like I just mentioned. Sometimes you're going to ask a user to upload a specific type of file, like maybe I want to go ahead and upload a picture of, there's my dog again, $500 an hour dog model, Stella. But what might happen is that a user might go ahead and try to upload a .doc file, right? We don't want that to happen, and so we can use JavaScript to tell our users that, hey, you're uploading the wrong file. You definitely should upload a JPEG. Do that instead, right? All right. Another really important aspect of JavaScript that you need to understand is AppCache for offline files. If we want users to be able to access our web pages or our web apps when they're offline, we're probably going to want to implement AppCache. Okay? AppCache allows us to store data locally when users are offline, and it's going to store resources like the HTML file, CSS files, and JavaScript locally on a user's machines. And so that's what allows them the ability. That's what allows them the ability to access those files when they're offline. Sorry guys, I'm getting a little tired today if you can't tell. And finally, the cache manifest file within the AppCache API, the application cache API, is going to dictate which type of information is stored offline. That cache manifest file is really just, it's a file that includes a list of all of the different files that are supposed to be stored when a user goes offline. So everything that's in that manifest is going to go ahead and just stay right on your computer after you lose internet connectivity. All right, lastly, we already talked about this with validating form input, and a lot of this can already be done on the client side with CSS and HTML, but JavaScript can also be used to validate user input. And so sometimes, you're going to maybe forget the @ symbol in an email address or forget to write .com. And so JavaScript is used to perform client-side validation in addition to CSS3, right? Or rather, you can use it in lieu of. So maybe we type Jane@live and forget the .com or .org or .net, and then JavaScript can prompt us to provide a valid email address. It's pretty cool stuff. Oh, and one last thing, cookies. And I'm not talking about the kind that you bake. All right. Cookies are small text files that websites save on your computer. Get rid of that second that there. They contain information about you and your preferences. And with JavaScript, you can store and retrieve information from cookies. Cookies, as we mentioned before in Module 1, they can cause some problems for people from a security standpoint. They also can cause some slowdown in terms of rendering and viewing content because cookies are actually stored on a server. And so every time that you request a website or access to a page, that cookie may be sent back from the server. So then the browser can use that information to render a page with user information or maybe even help generate ads that are more specific to you and your interests, if you guys are ever curious about that. But people are starting to move away from, developers are starting to move away from the use of cookies in favor of something like AppCache and also local storage and session storage, which will store your files and information. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this presentation. This was a pretty quick one. 4.3, we coded animations by using JavaScript, talked about how you would do that, the different types of animations you could create, and also about how you can manipulate a canvas element. We also went ahead and talked about how you can access data using JavaScript, transmitting data, loading and saving files, validating form input, and also cookies. Thanks again for joining me. I really enjoyed it. I'll see you guys again in Module 10, okay? Hi, I'm Cullen, and welcome back to HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. We're going to get started with Module 10, our final module. So without further ado, let's start talking about coding for the touch interface. Today we're going to talk about how to respond to the touch interface. Just touch interfaces in general will be detailed. We're also going to touch on Objective 4.6, coding additional HTML5 APIs. We've got 4 that we're going to talk about: geolocation, web workers, WebSockets, and the file API. And we're also going to touch on web storage again, local storage, and then also session storage. Okay. All right, guys, let's get going. Touch interfaces. So most of you are familiar by now with what a touch interface is, right? They're featured on tablets, on smartphones. All that they are screens that are developed specifically for sensing touch. There are a couple of different types available, right? Processors treat touches like mouse gestures, and then they relay all that information to an operating system and then ultimately to an application, right? So when you touch a screen, that gets turned into data, and that data gets transferred and relayed to an application, which then responds to that touch. We'll talk a little bit more about that process here today. All right, so finger moves are called gestures. So if I take this finger and I move it, oh, whoops, my apologies, guys. Let me bring on my marker. If I take this finger and I swipe to the right, that's a gesture, right? But gestures can also include presses, taps, and slides, all sorts of things, okay? How an application responds to a touch or a tap is called a touch event. And we can use JavaScript, including 3 different methods: touch start, touch end, and touch move, to create these touch events. Here's some common touch gestures. You've got tap, which is essentially the equivalent of a left click with a mouse. Double tap, which is a left double click. Press and hold, which is similar to a right click in order to bring up options on the screen. You got selection or drag. It's the same thing as being able to drag a file across the screen with a mouse. And then, of course, zoom, right? Zoom with the mouse, you hold control and then scroll your mouse wheel forward or backwards. With touch, we actually are going to pinch an object inwards, or we're going to go ahead and spread it outwards. Pretty simple stuff. Here are some common touch gestures, just a couple of different visuals, right? We've got tap, which is just a single tap. Double tap's a double tap. Drag, just moving, sliding to the left or the right. Pressing and holding is going to replicate that right click, and then zooming like we just talked about on screen. Oops. So when you make a gesture, you want your application to respond, right? In order to get that to happen, we use the add event listener method to attach an event handler to an HTML element. So if I press a button, I'm going to use the add event listener along with a touch event to go ahead and start a function that I've coded. And this is the general syntax below here, right? We have our touch event. Then we have our function. And my writing is atrocious today, so I'll apologize for that. And then finally, we're going to use the keyword false. I could discuss at length why false is there, but this is honestly something that is best if you take the time to look up, because it's a little difficult to understand, and there's definitely some reading that needs to be done. So do a quick Bing search for, I guess you could say, add event listener syntax, and then add the keyword touch, and then go ahead and hit enter. And you'll find some really great information on this syntax and the general format to use when adding event listeners, okay? All right, let's keep on going. A gesture event is very similar to a touch event, except a gesture event's a little bit different in that it's when multiple fingers touch the screen. So there's a lot to learn here, right? A touch event is when a single finger touches the screen, and then a gesture event is when multiple fingers touch the screen. Okay? Take a look at the description there. Similarly, you've got gesture start, gesture change, and then gesture end in comparison with touch start, touch end, and the other touch events. Okay, and of course here they are. We've got touch move and then also touch cancel. Okay. Definitely download these slides. Make sure that you take time to review these different things. They can and probably will be tested on your HTML5 application development exam. All right, so there are also different touch objects that we utilize with touch events, right? A touch object is going to detect input from touch-enabled devices. They're just they're added to something called a touch list, and a touch list is going to track all points of contact on a touch screen, right? So if you touch a touch screen with a single finger, that entry is going to be added to the touch list. Whereas if you touch something with your index finger and then your middle finger, both of those are going to create two different touch objects, which are then both going to be added to a touch list. Okay, so a little confusing, a little difficult to understand at first, but just keep in mind one finger equals one addition to the touch list, two fingers equals two additions to the touch list. Okay, all right. And of course, go ahead and take a look at the table on the right of the slide there in order to take a look at those different properties for touch objects. Each touch event also has 3 different touch lists. So not to make it any more confusing, but you don't just have one touch list to keep track of, you have three different touch lists. I'm going to go ahead and circle that for emphasis here. The 3 different touch lists are touches, target touches, and then change touches. Touches are just all points currently in contact with the screen. So if you put all 5 fingers on, that's going to keep track of that. Target touches are going to keep track of touch points that are currently in contact with the screen and whose touch start event occurred within the same node, so inside the same target element, right? It's like a button on screen. And then change touches is just a list of touch points that cause the current event to be fired. So in a touch end event, right, all that you're saying is that the finger was removed. So instead of dragging across the screen, or rather, if you drag something across the screen, when you lift your finger up, that's your touch end event, right? And so change touches is just going to keep track of changes that have occurred. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a quick demo here with touchscreens. Take a look at the code on the screen. This is what we're going to be using for this demo. All that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a canvas object and draw a blue square on screen. We've added the event listener. We've got some different syntax here that we haven't really talked about too much. These are called control statements in JavaScript. If, so we're saying if there's an onTouch start in document.documentElement, right, here in the canvas element, then we're going to add an event listener looking for the touch start. And then we're also going to add an event listener looking for a mouse down. So if touch is active, then we're going to run this first statement. If touch is not active, then we're going to run this second statement, okay? First, though, we want to make sure that we detect whether or not our screen is a touch screen, right? So we've got the detect method here, the function, we're taking a look to see if on touch start, right? If when we initialize our screen, if we're going to run, if we have a touch screen, if it's been detected, then we're going to alert the user that it's, they have a touchscreen device. If there isn't touch, then we're going to alert them that there is no touchscreen device detected, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at that in action, and keep in mind right now that I'm not using a touchscreen, so pay attention to what happens. I'm going to go ahead and open up my HTML, launch that in the browser from WebMatrix. And so I'm going to click the box to start touchscreen detection. All I do is I click it, and no touchscreen device was detected. So if I was on a tablet, it would definitely say that a touchscreen device was detected. Okay, all right. Let's go back to the presentation here real fast. HTML5 APIs, right? Really important to know this stuff for an exam. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's not waste any more time, okay? first, before we talk about the APIs themselves, let's talk about the organization that's responsible for them. The Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group was formed by Apple and the Mozilla Foundation, the creators of the Firefox browser, and then Opera Software, who created the Opera browser as well. They defined their own specification for HTML5. This organization, different from W3C, who we've referenced throughout this presentation and throughout our entire course, right? The WHATWG HTML5 specification includes these 4 APIs that we're just about to talk about, with geolocation, web workers, WebSockets, and then also file. So, all right, the geolocation API. You use this API and its source code to access geographical coordinates of a user's device. And when I say geographical coordinates, we're talking about latitude and longitude. There are 2 primary functions that you would use within this API, right? You've got get current position, which is going to say, hey, this is where this device is located, and then watch position, which is going to take a look at how or where that device is moving. So if I'm located here, and then all of a sudden I change my location, the watch position is going to be responsible for monitoring where I'm at any given point in time, okay? Commonly used, something that you're probably very familiar with. And of course, there's no code in this particular example. If you take a look at the slide again, that's going to show you how to display this on a map, but this is the information that's used with Bing Maps in order to be able to find out where something's located, in order to visualize where something is located. All right, so let's go ahead and just show a quick demo again. So I'm going to pop this open. Notice that I just went ahead and embedded my script inside of my HTML file this time for ease. I've got 2 different input boxes, right? I've got latitude and longitude. I'm going to click this button and I'm going to utilize our 2 methods that we just talked about in order to get the latitude and longitude, and let's see what happens. So notice localhost wants to track my physical location, right? So my browser wants to track location. I'm going to say allow once. And there it is, right? My latitude and longitude. It's pretty cool stuff. Pretty cool stuff that you can do with these APIs. So I'm going to close out of Internet Explorer and head back to the presentation. And let's talk about web workers. Take a look at the graphic on the right. It's not these guys, okay? It's not what web workers are. Web workers is an API, and what this API does is it runs JavaScript scripts in the background. Okay, so let's say that you you're on your browser. A browser traditionally can only run 1 script at a time. Sometimes you need background services to run in order to obtain information. So maybe you've got like a stock ticker, or you've got something along those lines, right? That needs to update every second, every moment that you're on a browser. And we're going to utilize web workers for that. All right, so let's go back to the presentation here. Web workers just pass information through messages. And they run separately from that main HTML document in something called a thread, right? So browsers traditionally only run 1 thread. Web workers allow them to run 2 threads, right? So they can run 2 scripts or execute 2 scripts at the same time. All right, next, let's talk about the WebSocket API. WebSocket API is great because it increases efficiency of data flow between a browser, your client machine, and a web server, right? It creates a simultaneous 2-way connection, and that simply allows data to flow back and forth pretty freely, not entirely freely, so keep that in mind. WebSockets also used for real-time applications like chat, online games, and also sports scores. There are 3 primary events you guys should be aware of. You got on open, so when a socket opens, on message, when a message is received from a web server, including some kind of HTML, right? We talked about that earlier. WebSocket's a little bit different from HTTP, which is traditionally used. And then also we have the on-close event there as well. And finally, the File API. It allows web applications to upload files from local storage to remote servers. File API, it features several different interfaces for accessing files. So you've got file file list, blob, and then file reader. File just is for uploading one file, or it reads in one file as a URL. File list is going to allow you to upload a list of files or multiple files. Blob provides access to raw binary data. And of course, file reader provides a way for users to go ahead and read and display a file on screen. So, all right. Let's finish up here with accessing device and system resources. We talked about the web storage API at length already. It just allows you to store data in the browser locally versus on a web server. There are two different types. There's local and then there's session storage. Local storage, no limit to how long the data persists, right? You can save a ton of different user information on a local machine, and it's going to stay there for as long as you want. Session storage, on the other hand, is going to save session data. So from when a user starts using the application, it's going to pull that data and it's going to save it locally for the duration of the session, right? Both objects allow users to store large amounts of data, and there's no slowdown in a connection because data isn't transferred back and forth from a web server, it's kept locally. We haven't talked yet about how to implement web storage, and in order to implement it, you want to use the local storage and session storage objects with these methods down here. Whoops, my bad there. With these methods down here in the table to manage key value pairs. And so a key is something as simple as maybe you have first name. And then a pair, since my name's Cullen, I'll go ahead and write my name here. A pair, or sorry, why did I say that? A value would be Cullen. Okay, so I've got the key, which is essentially a variable name, first name, right? And then the value that you would store in that variable, which would be Cullen, my first name. Let's talk about how to implement these methods here real quickly. For a session storage object, note that we go ahead and we make reference to the object. We're going to use the setItem method. Where it says key, we would enter something like name. And then for value, we would enter that value that we were talking about. And if you wanted to go ahead and access that item, right, you would just go ahead and use getItem key, and then you can store it in a variable here on the left there, myvar. Similarly, with local storage, you perform the same exact functions, setItem and also getItem with the key. And that's going to allow you to go ahead and set that data and then also get that data later. Okay. All right. Finally, accessing hardware. When you build HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript apps, they're device independent, which means that they can work on any platform, any device, anywhere, right? A smartphone, a tablet, a computer. These device independent apps, we build them to be able to access hardware capabilities such as your GPS system, an accelerometer, which is going to sense motion if you're using a phone, right? Smartphones all have accelerometers, and also the camera. And so you don't necessarily need to know how to implement these things for the HTML5 application development fundamentals exam, but you should be aware of the fact that if you build an app, it can access hardware. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about in Module 1 with the Windows runtime environment and how to make that possible. So keep that in mind. This has been a wonderful, wonderful time getting to know you. I'm just joking, we didn't get to know each other, but you did learn a lot of wonderful content, okay? Let's do a quick recap now. We went ahead and we covered Objective 4.5, respond to the touch interfaces in general. Talked about 4.6, coding additional HTML5 API, specifically geolocation, web workers, WebSockets, and the file API. And finally, we finish off talking about web storage once again, and also how to access, or what types of device resources you can access when building web apps. So thanks again for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned a lot.
That's all in this episode of this course. I hope this tutorial was helpful. See you in the next episode with another interesting course on coding and app development. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.